In 1634, a French missionary stood on a riverbank deep in the forests of North America and watched two alliances of native nations tear each other apart. The cause of this slaughter was not gold, and it was not land, and it was not faith. The cause was pelts. Small, wet, brown pelts from an ordinary rodent that most Europeans had never even seen alive a century earlier. The beaver. The same animal that builds dams and quietly gnaws on bark became the trigger for one of the bloodiest conflicts in early North American history. A conflict historians would later call the Beaver Wars, a war that cost tens of thousands of lives over hats worn in the parlors of Paris and London. But to understand how the pelt of a rodent turned into a weapon of geopolitics, we have to go back much further, to the point where fur first saved the human species from extinction. Roughly 40,000 years ago, during the coldest stretches of the last ice age, early humans across Europe and Asia faced a simple choice: find a way to hold on to body heat in sub-zero temperatures, or disappear the way entire populations of other species disappeared around them. The fur of mammoths, reindeer, wolves, and foxes stopped being decoration and became survival technology. Archaeologists have found bone needles more than 40,000 years old, shaped specifically for stitching hides into tight, insulated clothing. And it was this technology, not fire and not weapons, that allowed humans to settle the coldest regions on the planet, places no other primate ever reached. As millennia passed, fur stopped being just a tool for survival and started carrying social weight. In ancient China, under the Han Dynasty, fur robes made from sable and fox were worn exclusively by senior officials and members of the imperial family, and the law explicitly forbade commoners from wearing certain types of fur under threat of punishment. Across the steppes of Central Asia, nomadic tribes measured a family's status by how many sable or ermine pelts it owned, and fur was traded along routes that would later become part of the Great Silk Road. Though in the earliest caravans it was often fur, not silk, that made the journey. In medieval Europe, fur turned into a strictly coded symbol of power. Ermine, the same snow-white creature with the black-tipped tail, became the heraldic mark of royal dignity. The robes of English and French monarchs were lined with thousands of ermine tails, and sumptuary laws issued by European kings throughout the 14th and 15th centuries explicitly banned merchants and even minor nobility from wearing sable, ermine, or lynx, reserving those furs strictly for royal blood. Breaking such a law could cost a craftsman a fine equal to a full year's income. And in some German cities, a second offense meant losing property outright. During this period, fur literally announced where a person stood in the social order, and wearing the wrong pelt meant openly defying the crown itself. It was this very European obsession with fur that eventually triggered a tragedy on another continent. When European hat makers discovered near the end of the 15th and start of the 16th century that the undercoat of a beaver, the short barbed hairs beneath the outer fur, felted into a waterproof material of exceptional strength, a genuine hat craze swept across Europe. The beaver felt hat became mandatory for any gentleman, from a Paris banker to a London barrister, and demand grew so enormous that Europe's beaver population, already thinned by centuries of hunting, had crashed to dangerously low numbers before the 16th century even ended. Hat makers went looking desperately for a new supply. And that is when ships returning from the newly discovered continent of North America brought back news that would decide the fate of an entire continent. There, beavers numbered in the millions. Historians' estimates vary, but most researchers agree that before European contact, the beaver population of North America ranged somewhere between 60 and 400 million animals. And the continent's rivers and streams were literally carved by beaver dam systems that regulated water levels across enormous territories. To French and later English and Dutch trading companies, this looked like an endless source of gold. Except this gold came in brown fur. The French crown established a colony in the St. Lawrence Valley, largely to control the beaver pelt trade, and trading companies paid native hunters in metal kettles, cloth, and firearms for every pelt they brought out of the forest. This is where the darkest chapter of this story begins. The Iroquois Confederacy, which controlled the trade routes around what is now New York State, had exhausted the beaver population on its own land by the mid-17th century and faced a choice: lose its position as the dominant middleman in trade with the Dutch and the English, or seize the hunting grounds of neighboring nations by force. They chose force. Between 1609 and 1698, the Iroquois waged a series of campaigns against the Huron, the Erie, the Petun, and other nations of the Great Lakes region. Campaigns so devastating that some of these peoples were effectively wiped out as distinct political nations, their survivors forcibly absorbed into the tribes of the victors. Historians and anthropologists who have studied this period note that the conflict would never have reached this scale or duration without European demand for fur, which turned beaver hunting from a traditional practice into a source of weapons, metal tools, and the survival of an entire people. European trading companies, for their part, knowingly supplied weapons to both sides of the conflict, interested only in keeping the pelts flowing. The stakes in this trade grew so high that they ended up shaping the borders of entire empires. In 1670, the English crown granted the Hudson's Bay Company a monopoly over the fur trade across a territory covering nearly a third of modern Canada, land the company called its own, even though it never physically controlled most of it. This company would become the longest continuously operating corporation in North American history, and competition between the British and the French over beaver territory became one of the key factors behind the 7 Years' War, a conflict some historians describe as the first true world war, and one that would ultimately decide who controlled the North American continent. The cost of this success turned out to be catastrophic for the very animal that made it possible. By the start of the 20th century, after nearly 300 years of continuous industrial hunting, the beaver population of North America had collapsed from hundreds of millions to roughly 100,000 animals, vanishing entirely from vast stretches of land where its dams had once regulated whole river systems. As the beaver disappeared, so did the wetlands it created. Land dried out, groundwater levels dropped, and species that depended on beaver ponds lost their habitat. It was an ecological catastrophe that unfolded slowly, almost unnoticed by a public preoccupied with hat fashion. Salvation, when it came, arrived not through compassion, but through a simple twist of fashion. By the mid-19th century, European hat makers began switching to silk top hats, which looked sleeker and cost less to produce than traditional beaver felt. Demand for beaver pelts collapsed just as the species stood on the edge of total disappearance from the continent. And this accidental shift in fashion almost certainly spared the beaver from the fate that befell the passenger pigeon, another species driven to extinction by industrial-scale hunting, gone completely by 1914. The 20th century brought a growing recognition of just how much damage had been done, and with it, the first real attempts to undo it. One of the strangest chapters in this entire story took place in 1948 in the American state of Idaho, where wildlife officials ran into a very practical problem. Beavers being relocated away from new settlements did not survive truck transport over mountain roads well, and many died en route. An engineer named Elmo Hetter came up with a solution that still sounds almost unbelievable today. He designed special boxes that opened by parachute, and beavers were literally dropped from airplanes into remote mountain valleys. The operation became informally known as beaver drop, and of the 76 animals relocated this way, nearly all survived, going on to rebuild the local population within a few years entirely on their own. That story, though it sounds like a footnote, actually reflects a much broader shift in how humans viewed the beaver throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. Scientists gradually came to understand something native nations of North America had known long before European contact, that the beaver is what ecologists call a keystone species, an animal whose activity literally shapes the landscape and sustains biodiversity across entire ecosystems. Today, a growing number of countries and states are actively reintroducing beavers as a tool against drought and for wetland restoration, since beaver dams naturally hold water, reduce wildfire risk, and rebuild habitat for hundreds of other species. An animal once hunted nearly to extinction for the sake of hats is now treated as a free and remarkably effective climate engineer. At the same time, the fur industry as a whole followed a far more complicated and contentious path into the modern era. Fur farms, raising mink, fox, and chinchilla specifically for their pelts, became the target of intense ethical debate over recent decades, and investigations into the conditions on such farms sparked public outrage in many countries. In response, a number of nations, including the United Kingdom, Austria, the Netherlands, and several other European countries, banned fur farming outright on their territory. At the same time, major fashion houses, from Gucci to Prada, publicly announced they would no longer use real fur in their collections. And the faux fur industry grew into a billion-dollar market built to imitate luxury without a living animal behind it. And yet, fur never vanished from human life any more than it vanished from human history. It traveled from an Ice Age survival technology to a symbol of royal power, from a currency that started wars and toppled nations to the near total destruction of a species, and finally, to a symbol of ecological recovery. The same beaver whose pelt once cost so much blood in the forests around the Great Lakes is now dropped from airplanes not for trade, but to save rivers that have run dry. The material that once decided who sat on a throne and who was punished for breaking a luxury law is now the subject of lawsuits and fashion activist campaigns. The history of fur is a history of how humanity kept turning nature into luxury, luxury into power, and power into bloodshed, until nature sent back a bill that always, eventually, had to be paid.